Well, joining me now, three of the best political analysts in the country, CNN contributors all. Republican strategist, former White House political director, chairman of the Mike Huckabee presidential campaign, Ed Rollins. Good to have you here, Ed. Columnist, New York Daily News, host, morning show, WWRL, Errol Louis. Errol. And Democratic strategist, Robert Zimmerman, Democratic National Committeeman. Robert, good to have you here. It looks like, well, with an extra $350 billion, there's going to be a little discussion about what happens with money. This is another victory for a president-elect. You don't often have legislative victories for president-elects.
Sure.
The expectations, Robert, are soaring here. How much of a problem are we going to have with soaring expectations?
Well, the problem's going to be with how this president spends the money. The Democratic Congress wrote a bill, and to your credit, you pointed out the pitfalls and gave them more and fair warning, but it was a piece of legislation so poorly crafted, even Chris Dodd acknowledged they had to stiffen the bill. Maybe their backbones, too. But this
and Chris Dodd is still mad at me for making those observations.
But the point is he recognized the legislation had to change. But here's what's significant. This bill passed with 46 Democrats and with 6 Republicans. And we talked last Friday about why the president's rhetoric was so intense. Obviously, he was trying to galvanize this Congress, and the strategy worked.
When Robert uses the word intense, he's referring to my question as whether or not this was the rhetoric of fear rather than the rhetoric of hope.
You don't forget anything.
I'm curious to see whether or not this continues. Ed Henry, our White House correspondent, pointing out that's something that is concerning the staff of the president-elect right now because they have to have a balance. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the rhetoric of fear, maybe not fear that the economy will collapse if they don't do anything, but rather fear that they will have severe political consequences. I was looking at today's numbers from Gallup. The approval ratings for the president-elect are in the stratosphere. I mean, you're talking about 78%, in some cases over 80%.
On issues. 60% on approval.
On how he's handled the transition, on his cabinet appointments, even though there've been a couple of bumps in the road. So I wouldn't get in the way of a train like that if I were a Republican at this point.
Sometimes,
listen, Republicans are not relevant. I've said this over and over again, Errol, and you keep wanting to go there. It's now a Democrat game, and the other part of this is that the Congress is still very unpopular. You look at and so they have to perform, and they have to spend the public's money in a way that clearly makes the economy move forward again. And I don't think anybody can guarantee that at this point in time.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue because the Republicans talk about being marginalized. They have been marginalized to the point that it's absurd in some respects, but they're making. But the Democratic Party, when we're talking about $825 billion as the Democratic leadership of Congress and this president-elect are, $350 billion in this bailout money additional, a $1.2 trillion budget deficit, and the president-elect is talking about a fiscal responsibility summit in February. Is this colossal irony?
Well, it's also ultimately the reality of the situation, which is there's no question, everyone recognizes this economic climate, we're going to have to spend our way out of this crisis. And of course, the consequences of it could be inflation down the road that could be very dramatic and very severe.
I'm not an economist, but the idea that we have to spend our way out of this crisis, that we have to create more debt to get out of a crisis created by debt and by... Excuse me, let me just finish the sentence. You're so aggressive tonight, Robert. A crisis created by debt and by spending, this is at best counterintuitive.
Well, the dilemma here is you can't create a whole bunch of public jobs because there's no long lasting there. I mean, Bill Clinton created 100,000 policemen, thought it was going to solve crime. 2 years later, those cops' jobs were eliminated because the local communities couldn't pay it.
And the money went away.
And so I think the key thing here is you can't substitute public spending only for capitalism. Capitalism may be on the ropes, but you got to do something to create private jobs in addition to the public jobs. Otherwise, we're going to have a very soft economy.
And if the assumption is that it will happen. This is intended to sort of bridge the gap and not let too much of the economy just run into the ground.
That's a big assumption.
We're going to ask Errol Louis if that's a bridge to nowhere or to something better. Our panel will be right back with us. But first, a reminder to join me on the radio Monday through Fridays for the Lou Dobbs Show. Monday's guests include Senator Jim DeMint, Republican, South Carolina conservative leading the charge against some of this spending. And we invite you to go to LouDobbsRadio.com to get your local listings for the Lou Dobbs Show on the radio. A reminder that I'm now on WOR here in New York City 2 to 4 each Monday through Friday. We'll be right back with more from our panel. We're back with our panel, Ed Rollins, Errol Louis, Robert Zimmerman. All of this talk about money to build a bridge to what? We've got $8 trillion thrown at this economic crisis. We don't have any instinct from any one of our leaders, the Treasury Secretary, the Federal Reserve, the Congress of the United States, or this president as to what that money has accomplished and what it was expected to accomplish. The American people in the CNN opinion research poll saying 86% say they know this isn't working. They're opposed to bailouts. This puts a real limit on the horizons for this administration if real results are not achieved with this money.
Well, I think that's why you saw the president doing something I had actually recommended in a column. I'd love to think that he just read it and took my advice.
Well, I'm sure he did, Errol.
Go out on the road, stop in a factory, show people what the money's going to buy, that this isn't going to just be a blank check written to a bunch of bankers to be used in some invisible, non-accountable way, but that this is going to bring... Well, but that the recovery portion, the bailout, you know, that's one thing, but going forward, the big bill he's trying to move is his first piece of major legislation.
The first bailout, though, because the funds were used to go into the funds were used for banks to buy other successful banks, or banks were hoarding the money.
Yeah,
they weren't addressing. They weren't in fact addressing the foreclosure crisis. Yeah. People didn't see the results, and that's really the challenge here.
Paulson, Treasury Secretary Paulson, basically used the money to bail out his buddies on Wall Street. And don't let anybody kid you.
No question. There's also this great myth going back to the Great Depression that all of the spending that FDR did basically moved the economy back quickly. It was 5-6 years, and it was the war. It was the build-up to the war, and it was the war that got us out. We've had our war, and at the end of the day, you know, we better have something that stimulates this economy.
Think about this. Think about this. With all of the money being spent on the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, that is stimulative spending by any definition. The $8 trillion thrown at this crisis, and we have yet to hear an official say this is what it's accomplished, what it's achieved. In fact, we heard the president-elect today say things may get worse before they get better. That's an extraordinary position to be in. Let me do one thing very quickly and just point out the latest poll, the Marist poll shows Andrew Cuomo with a 60% favorable rating, Caroline Kennedy 46. You're saying that Patterson, I believe, Cuomo 25 for Kennedy there among registered voters. David Patterson still going to appoint her?
I don't think he's doing it on the basis of polls. If he were, Cuomo
all politicians are above polls.
Well,
I
don't know about above.
Do that.
I don't know about above.
Especially when they're running in the same year, you know.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it with that. Thank you very much, Robert. Errol, thank you. Ed, thank you. Up next, tonight's poll results. Some more of your thoughts. Stay with us. We'll be right back.